Attention! This channel provides original historical analysis based on sources and research. We do not simply recount events, we analyze their causes and consequences, explaining them through original narration, editing, and visual diagrams. A list of sources is included in the description. Enjoy watching. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're looking at a real historical event, one that most people have never heard of, but which changed the outcome of a battle that cost the United States Army more than 33,000 casualties. This is a story about a man who brought something from home to the deadliest forest in the Western Front, something no military manual had ever considered. This is the Hurtgen Forest. In December 1944, while the Western Front consumed men by the thousands, a 12-man patrol slipped into a frozen German forest before dawn. They were sent to observe, to look and report back. They were not expected to change anything. By sunrise, a fortified German position held by over 200 soldiers had fallen. The patrol had lost no one. The weapon that made it possible was not in any Army equipment catalog. It was a raw potato from the bottom of a soldier's pack. Before a soldier becomes a legend, he is simply a man doing what he knows. William Edward Jones was born on March 14, 1920, in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, a logging and mining town of roughly 3,700 people set against the dense pine forests of the northwestern United States. The land there was cold, quiet, and unforgiving in the particular way that rural American communities were unforgiving during the early decades of the 20th century. There was no margin for excess. Everything that could be wasted, time, money, ammunition, was not wasted. His father, Thomas Jones, held a position at a local bank, which placed the family a step above subsistence, but nowhere near comfort. The farm attached to their property was not a hobby. It was a supplement without which the family's diet would have been measurably worse. Meat did not come from a store. It came from the forest. Every cartridge had a cost, and that cost was calculated against what the shot was expected to return. This is the environment in which William's understanding of firearms was formed, not on a range, not under instruction, in the field where a miss had a direct and immediate consequence for the people who depended on him. By the age of 12, he was hunting without supervision. His father's instruction had been reduced to a single principle: if you raise the rifle, the shot must count. No philosophy was attached to this rule. It was arithmetic. The discipline it produced was more demanding than anything a standard training program would later require of him, because in training, a missed shot costs a score. In the Idaho forest, it cost dinner. Thomas Jones passed on one further technique which had reached him second-hand from a veteran of the First World War, who had in turn received it from a trapper working the northern forests. The principle was simple. A raw potato, hollowed at the center to clear the barrel, bound tightly to the muzzle with cloth, would absorb a significant portion of the expanding gas produced at the moment of firing. The result was a reduction in the sharp, directional crack that a standard rifle report produces, the sound that carries across open terrain and tells every living thing within range exactly where the shot originated. The physics involved were not sophisticated. The potato was not a precision instrument, but in the right conditions, it did not need to be. William tested the method at 14. A group of squirrels had been working through the family garden with persistent efficiency, and conventional shooting had proven counterproductive. Each shot scattered the rest before he could follow up. He hollowed a russet potato with his knife, taking care to leave enough material around the edges to contain the gas without obstructing the bullet's path. He wrapped it with strips of cloth and pressed it firmly against the muzzle. He fired. The sound that came out was not a gunshot. It was a compressed thud, low, directionless, absorbed almost immediately by the surrounding air. The first squirrel dropped. The others paused, uncertain, and did not run. He had 3 more within the minute. Over the next 6 years, he refined every variable through repetition. He established that russet potatoes outperformed waxy varieties due to their higher starch and lower moisture content. A denser internal structure absorbed gas more consistently. He learned the tolerance limits. A single potato handled 2 to 3 shots reliably before heat degradation made it unpredictable. He learned that attachment was critical. A loose fitting would send the device off the barrel on the first shot, and with it, every advantage the method provided. None of this refinement was conducted with military application in mind. Jones was optimizing a hunting technique. The idea that these afternoons in an Idaho garden would one day apply to a defensive position in a German forest was not a thought he had entertained. On December 7, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor removed that distance entirely. Jones walked into the Army recruitment office in Spokane, Washington, on January 3, 1942. In the occupation field on his enlistment form, he wrote 2 words, logger, hunter. The recruiting officer reviewed his file and flagged it for the sniper selection process before the end of the week. The forests of Idaho had produced exactly the kind of man the United States Army needed and could not manufacture in a training camp. Patient, economical, and quietly unconventional in ways that would only become visible under the specific conditions of combat. Those conditions were waiting for him in Germany. They had a name, the Hurtgen Forest. Write in the comments what city you're from and subscribe to the channel. That's the best support you can give us. And we move on. The Hurtgen Forest did not care about battle plans. Stretching approximately 50 square miles along the German-Belgian border southeast of Aachen, the Hurtgenwald was a dense expanse of pine and fir trees, cut through by broken ravines and narrow dirt tracks that dissolved into mud the moment autumn rains arrived. Military planners studying the map in September 1944 saw a manageable obstacle, a patch of difficult terrain between Allied forward positions and the strategically vital Roar River crossings to the east. What no map could communicate was what that forest would do to the men ordered to enter it. The United States Army committed its first significant forces to the Hurtgen in mid-September 1944, following the rapid liberation of France and the momentum-driven push toward Germany's western border. The operational logic was considered sound. The forest had to be cleared to prevent German forces from using it to strike the flank of the broader Allied advance into Germany. The assumption was that clearing it would take weeks. It took months, and the cost was measured in a currency the planning staff had not fully priced. What made the Hurtgen different from every other major engagement of the Western Front campaign was the total reversal of conditions that American forces had learned to exploit. In Normandy and across France, Allied advantages had been consistent: air superiority that could be called upon to break up concentrations of armor and infantry, armored units that could exploit gaps in enemy lines, artillery observers with sufficient visibility to correct fire in real time. The Hurtgen stripped every one of those advantages away with methodical completeness. Armored vehicles entered the forest and immediately lost the mobility that made them effective. The trees grew closely enough that tanks could not maneuver off the established tracks, and the established tracks were exactly where German engineers had concentrated their minefields. A single disabled vehicle on a forest road blocked everything behind it. Column after column stalled under fire, unable to advance and difficult to reinforce. The armor that had rolled across France in the summer became dead weight in the German pines in the fall. Artillery, the most consistently decisive weapon in the Allied inventory, was similarly degraded. Forward observers needed line of sight to adjust fire accurately. In the Hurtgen, line of sight ended at the nearest tree line, often less than 50 meters away. Shells fired into the canopy detonated on contact with the upper branches, sending fragments downward rather than outward, killing men in positions that would have been protected from ground-burst fire. This phenomenon, known as tree burst, turned the forest itself into a weapon system working against the attackers. Air support, which had been available throughout the summer campaign, became functionally irrelevant. The dense canopy concealed movement on the ground from aircraft above. The persistent overcast that settled over the Eifel region from October onward grounded close air support missions for days at a time. When aircraft could fly, they could not identify targets. The forest absorbed everything. The German military had not stumbled into this defensive advantage accidentally. The Hurtgen had been prepared with considerable precision over the preceding months. Defensive positions were sited on the high ground throughout the forest, positioned to take advantage of every natural elevation change. The approaches to these positions were covered by interlocking fields of fire, meaning that attacking one bunker meant coming under fire from 2 or 3 others positioned to its flanks. Minefields were laid not randomly, but according to a calculated logic, channeling attacking infantry toward prepared kill zones. The wire obstacles strung between trees forced soldiers off established paths. The paths themselves were registered by German artillery, meaning that any concentration of American troops on a forest road could be struck by pre-plotted fire within minutes of being observed. Every feature of the terrain that an attacker might use for cover or movement had been analyzed and accounted for in the German defensive plan. The forest was not simply a difficult environment. It was a carefully engineered trap. By December 1944, the 4th Infantry Division had been operating in and around the Hurtgen for more than 3 months. The division had sustained over 5,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing during that period. Forward progress was measured in increments that would have seemed absurd in any other theater. 200 meters in a day was considered significant. Some positions changed hands multiple times within a single week, taken at enormous cost, and then lost to counterattack overnight. The men who survived the Hurtgen described it consistently in terms that went beyond physical hardship. The forest produced a particular psychological condition, a combination of isolation, constant threat from invisible positions, and the specific disorientation that comes from fighting in terrain where direction, distance, and sound all behave unreliably. Medical casualty rates from combat exhaustion and exposure during the Hurtgen campaign exceeded those from any comparable operation in the European theater. It was into this environment, 3 months deep into its worst phase, that Sergeant William Edward Jones and 11 other men were sent before dawn on December 8, 1944. Their orders were explicit and limited. Observe the German defensive layout around Hill 319, record what they found, and return without making contact. Jones received the briefing, acknowledged his orders, and packed 6 raw russet potatoes at the bottom of his kit. The patrol entered the forest at 0300 hours. 12 men moved in single file through pine trees so dense that the soldier behind could barely distinguish the outline of the man ahead. The temperature held just above freezing, cold enough to stiffen fingers and numb exposed skin, but not cold enough to harden the ground underfoot. Wet pine needles carpeted the forest floor, absorbing footsteps with a consistency that no dry terrain could replicate. The men communicated exclusively through hand signals. A whisper in the Hurtgen carried further than intuition suggested. Sound here was unpredictable, and unpredictability in a minefield kills. The route to the observation point had been partially mapped from previous patrols, but partial information in the Hurtgen was never fully reliable. The forest changed its character between visits. A path that had been passable 2 days earlier might now be blocked by a fallen tree, or worse, marked with fresh wire and a pressure plate underneath the snow. Every step required deliberate placement. The patrol's pace was slow by design. Speed in this forest was a form of carelessness, and carelessness had a consistent outcome. At 0430, the 12 men reached the designated observation point, a shallow ridge with a natural depression in the ground that provided concealment without requiring them to construct a hide. Below, a low draw opened up between the tree lines, and within it, the German defensive position around Hill 319 was visible as a collection of shapes and movements against the pre-dawn gray. The forest's darkness was not absolute at this hour. The ambient light reflected off snow patches and frost was sufficient for a patient observer to read what was happening below with reasonable clarity. Lieutenant Richard Richardson raised his field binoculars and began his assessment. What he saw confirmed the intelligence estimate in most respects. Approximately 30 to 40 soldiers were visible within the draw. A light machine gun emplacement occupied elevated ground at the northern edge of the positioned to cover the most likely approach route from the west. Communication wire ran east along the tree line, a reliable indicator of a signals post within several hundred meters in that direction. The positions were interconnected, the coverage was layered, and the garrison appeared to be of company strength, consistent with the estimate of roughly 250 men in the broader defensive sector. The mission objective had been met. Richardson had what Division Command had sent him to find. By the operational order in his pocket, the next action was withdrawal, quiet, immediate, and without contact. The information would be delivered to headquarters, processed into the planning cycle, and used to inform a future assault that would cost considerably more than 12 men to execute. Jones was not watching Richardson. He had not been watching Richardson since the moment they reached the ridge. His attention had settled on the draw below with the particular quality of focus that has no military term but every experienced hunter recognizes immediately. A state of observation in which the observer becomes functionally still, processing information continuously while generating no signal that could alert the observed. He had entered this state automatically. It was not a technique he applied. It was what his nervous system defaulted to when he was in a forest with a rifle and something worth watching below. What he was reading in the behavior of the German soldiers was more detailed than Richardson's tactical assessment. Richardson was logging positions and equipment, the professional evaluation of a trained officer identifying military assets. Jones was reading individuals. The soldier near the shelter entrance who had been standing in the same spot for 11 minutes, shifting weight from foot to foot, finishing a cigarette with the unhurried manner of a man whose attention was entirely elsewhere. The two men near the eastern wire who were speaking to each other, both facing inward, neither one maintaining observation of the surrounding terrain. The sentry at the northern edge of the draw who had stopped scanning and was now looking at the ground in front of him. These were not alert soldiers. These were tired men in a position they had held long enough that vigilance had been replaced by routine. Their threat awareness was oriented in one direction, forward, toward the expected axis of any American attack. The ridge behind them, on the far side of their own defensive line, had been mentally classified as secure. In 3 months of continuous occupation, nothing had come from that direction. The classification had hardened into assumption. Jones opened his pack without shifting his body weight. His hand moved to the bottom and located a russet potato by touch alone. He drew his knife. Working in complete darkness, guided entirely by the muscle memory of hundreds of repetitions over 6 years, he positioned the blade and began hollowing the center of the potato. The cut required precision. Too much material removed, and the structural integrity collapsed under the first shot's gas pressure. Too little, and the bullet's path was obstructed, with consequences that ranged from inaccuracy to a dangerous barrel obstruction. He had found the correct margin years ago. His hands maintained it without conscious calculation. He wrapped the prepared potato with cloth, pressed it against the muzzle of the Springfield M1903A4, and secured it with tape in 3 firm passes. He checked the fit by applying lateral pressure. It did not move. Around him, the other members of the patrol had registered what he was doing. No one spoke. Several exchanged glances. Most had heard some version of the potato story during the weeks they had operated together. In a combat unit, unconventional habits circulate as anecdote long before they are tested as tactics. Richardson lowered his binoculars. He looked at Jones. He looked at the draw below. He made no decision that he recorded or later reported making. He simply did not issue the withdrawal order. At 4:37, Jones settled into a prone firing position, using the natural contour of the frozen ground as his rest. His cheek met the stock with the practiced contact of a man for whom this was not a posture but a resting state. His breathing slowed through 3 controlled cycles and then reduced further to the shallow minimum required to keep the sight picture stable. Below, at approximately 230 yards, a German soldier stood beside a shelter entrance with his back to the ridge, the ember of a cigarette visible as a faint orange point in the gray air. The wind moved left to right at a speed Jones assessed as 4 to 6 miles per hour, a standard correction, well within his established experience at this distance. He made the adjustment without numbers, the same way he had made it in the forests of Idaho at 14, at 16, at 20. The calculation was not arithmetic. It was recognition. He exhaled. The trigger broke at the natural end of the breath. The sound that came from the muzzle was not a gunshot. It was a compression, a blunt, formless thud that lasted less than 1/10 of a second and left no echo. The pine trees absorbed it. The wet air dispersed what remained. By the time the sound had traveled 30 meters in any direction, it had ceased to carry the directional signature that the human auditory system uses to locate a source. It was noise. The forest was already full of noise. The soldier below dropped without a sound of his own. The men nearest to him did not react. Not one head turned toward the ridge. The forest had taken the shot and kept it. The second shot followed the first within 40 seconds. A German soldier had moved toward the man on the ground, not running, not with urgency, but with the hesitant approach of someone who has registered that something is wrong but has not yet assigned it a cause. He crouched beside the fallen man and reached out. Jones had already discarded the first potato, positioned the second, checked the binding with 2 firm presses of his thumb, and returned his cheek to the stock. The trigger broke. The same directionless compression dissolved into the forest air. The second man went down beside the first, and the draw below remained as it had been, unhurried, unalarmed, operating on the assumption that nothing had changed. This was the critical window. Every hunter knows it. In the seconds immediately following a shot, the surrounding animals have registered an anomaly, but have not yet converted that registration into a coordinated response. The information exists in the environment, a sound, a movement, something slightly wrong, but the interpretation lags behind. That lag is the only interval that matters. Jones had been exploiting this interval since he was 14 years old in an Idaho garden. He did not think about it consciously. He simply moved through it with the efficiency of long practice. Over the following 12 minutes, he fired 17 rounds. The selection of targets followed a logic that owed nothing to military doctrine and everything to predatory instinct. He did not engage the nearest soldiers or the most exposed ones. He identified function. The sentry positioned closest to the light machine gun emplacement was the first priority. Remove the eyes on the most dangerous weapon in the position. Next, the soldier moving along the eastern tree line with what appeared to be a radio handset pressed to his ear. Then a man near the center of the draw whose body language, facing others, gesturing, pointing, indicated he was issuing instructions rather than receiving them. Leadership, communications, and observation. These were the categories Jones was working through, in that order. The potatoes degraded on a consistent schedule, exactly as his years of testing had established. 2 to 3 shots per device before the structural integrity of the material collapsed under the combined stress of gas pressure and heat. Each replacement took under 10 seconds. The rifle remained at his shoulder throughout. His right hand dropped to the muzzle, stripped the used device, confirmed the replacement was seated, and returned to the grip. The sequence was mechanical and silent. The other members of the patrol, lying in the frozen pine needles around him, watched without speaking. There was nothing useful to say. Inside the draw below, the situation was developing in a way that the German garrison had no prepared response for. Men were falling at irregular intervals. There was no incoming fire that the ear could classify and locate. no muzzle flash, no sound signature consistent with any weapon in their operational experience. The sharp crack that precedes a supersonic bullet, the sound that trained soldiers instinctively turned toward and used to calculate direction, was absent. What reached them instead was something blunt and ambient, a sound the forest already contained in a dozen variations. The human auditory system is highly effective at locating a sharp, isolated report. It is far less effective at extracting directional information from a low, diffuse thud embedded in background noise. The result was a specific and paralyzing form of confusion. The soldiers below understood that men were dying. They did not understand why, or from where, or how many opponents were responsible. In the absence of a located threat, the standard tactical response, return fire, identify and suppress the source, communicate the position to adjacent units, was impossible to execute. You cannot suppress a source you cannot find. You cannot communicate a position you have not identified. The garrison's trained responses required information that the situation was not providing. Different men reacted in different ways, and none of those reactions addressed the actual problem. Some moved toward the fallen soldiers, which brought them into the open. Some moved toward cover, which removed them from any observation role they had been performing. Some called out across the draw, attempting to establish a shared picture of what was happening. But voices carry in a forest, and raising your voice above the ambient noise of wind and artillery rumble was itself a form of exposure. The collective awareness of the position was fragmenting rather than consolidating, which was precisely the condition that allowed Jones to continue operating from the same location without relocating between shots. By 5:10, 32 rounds had been fired from the ridge. 29 confirmed engagements. The machine gun position at the northern edge of the draw had not fired a single round. Its operator was among the first men Jones had selected, and without him, the weapon sat in its emplacement unused. The communications wire running east along the tree line had gone silent. The soldier who had been carrying the radio handset was on the ground near the center of the draw. The man who had been issuing directions was no longer visible. The position's command structure, its observation capacity, and its communications had been methodically removed over the course of less than 30 minutes, without a single alarm being effectively raised. Richardson had stopped recording position data several minutes earlier. He was watching through his binoculars with the fixed concentration of a man whose original calculation has been overtaken by a reality he had not anticipated. He had come to this ridge to observe a functioning defensive position and report its layout to Division Command. What he was observing now was something categorically different. A position in progressive functional collapse, losing its ability to respond, coordinate, and resist, not because of artillery or a massed infantry assault, but because a single rifleman with a modified bolt-action rifle and 6 raw potatoes had spent 30 minutes removing every person inside it who knew what to do next. The original mission had been completed and rendered obsolete within the same hour. Richardson lowered his binoculars. He looked at the draw. He looked at the 12 men lying in the frozen ground around him. The German position below was not silent. There was movement. There were voices. There was the residual activity of a garrison that had not been physically destroyed. But its capacity to organize a coherent defense had been severed at the critical points. The difference between a fortified position and an occupied piece of ground is the ability of the men inside it to function as a coordinated unit. That ability was gone. He gave the order to advance. At 600 hours on December 8, 1944, Hill 319 was in American hands. The patrol descended from the ridge in a tight formation, weapons raised, moving through the draw with the deliberate caution of men who understood that a position is not secure until every corner of it has been physically verified. What they found was not resistance. The bunkers were empty, or contained men who had dropped their weapons. Several German soldiers were discovered sitting against the interior walls of their shelters, making no movement toward their rifles. The machine gun at the northern emplacement had not been fired. The communication wire running east had been cut, not by the patrol, but apparently by retreating soldiers who had pulled it loose in their withdrawal. The position had not been defeated by force of arms in the conventional sense. It had been evacuated by men who no longer understood what they were defending against. The formal after-action record was brief and precise. 12 men from the 4th Infantry Division reconnaissance element had advanced on and secured a fortified German defensive position. Patrol casualties: 0 killed, 2 minor injuries sustained during movement over frozen terrain in darkness. Enemy casualties confirmed: 29 dead, 11 prisoners. The remainder of the garrison had withdrawn eastward into the deeper forest. The report was filed at divisional headquarters before 0800 hours. The officers who received it did not believe it. This reaction was not unreasonable. The Hurtgen Forest had spent 3 months establishing a consistent and brutal baseline for what it cost to take ground. The division's institutional knowledge of this terrain was built from hundreds of engagements in which the arithmetic had never varied significantly. Fortified positions required artillery preparation, coordinated infantry assault, and a casualty rate that commanders had come to treat as an unavoidable operational expense. A single bunker complex in this forest had halted battalion-sized attacks on multiple occasions. The notion that 12 men with individual weapons, no supporting arms, and no armor had cleared an equivalent position in under 90 minutes without losing a single soldier fell entirely outside the range of outcomes that 3 months of combat experience had established as possible. Headquarters began collecting individual statements from patrol members through the morning. The accounts were cross-referenced, challenged, and compared against each other with the skeptical thoroughness appropriate to a report of this kind. What emerged from that process was not inconsistency. Every man described the same sequence of events in the same order, with the same details. The absence of audible gunfire, the visible confusion spreading through the German position below, the extended period during which the defense made no coherent response, the advance that met no organized resistance. When 12 separate accounts align with that degree of precision on events that none of the men had time to coordinate their stories about, the explanation is not fabrication. It is that they all witnessed the same thing. Headquarters shifted from the question of whether it had happened to the more demanding question of how. The operational analysis that followed worked through the contributing factors methodically. The acoustic environment of the Hurtgen Forest in December was categorically different from any terrain American forces had previously operated in during the campaign. Dense pine canopy absorbed high-frequency sound waves before they could travel meaningful distances. The saturated winter air dispersed pressure rapidly and unevenly. The broken, uneven ground fragmented the directional character of any sound that survived the canopy and the air. A rifle shot in open terrain is a precisely located event. The ear assigns it a direction within fractions of a second. In the Hurtgen, that directional precision was structurally degraded before any modification to the weapon was considered. Jones's improvised device had not produced silence. It had reduced the sharp muzzle blast, the high-frequency initial crack of propellant ignition, to a sound that no longer carried the acoustic signature the human ear uses to locate a firearm. The supersonic crack of the bullet in flight remained, and at certain angles and distances it could be detected. But in combination with the forest's natural acoustic properties, the ambient noise of wind and distant artillery, and the cognitive baseline of soldiers who had mentally classified that ridge as a safe direction, the degraded report was consistently insufficient to trigger a localization response. The defenders heard something. They could not assign it a source. That gap between awareness of a threat and identification of its location was the interval Jones had been working inside for 30 minutes. The analysis identified a tactical principle that was already being applied instinctively by experienced personnel in the field, but had not been formalized in operational guidance. The most critical targets in a defended forest position were not the soldiers with rifles. They were the soldiers whose roles sustained the position's ability to function. The forward observer who directed artillery, the communications man who relayed information between positions, the non-commissioned officer whose judgment held the unit's response together under pressure. Remove these individuals, and the physical fortifications remained intact. The weapons remained loaded, and the remaining soldiers were still present. But the position's capacity to coordinate, respond, and resist had been severed at its essential points. A fortified position in the Hurtgen Forest was not a collection of weapons. It was a network of functions. Destroying the network did not require destroying every node. It required identifying which nodes were load-bearing and removing them in the correct sequence. Jones had done this by instinct, applying the same logic he used when selecting targets in a dense wood where disturbing the group too early would scatter everything before he could follow up. The military application and the hunting application were, at their core, the same calculation. This understanding began moving through the division's operational planning, not as a formal doctrinal revision, but as practical guidance accumulated through field orders and patrol briefings. Sniper and reconnaissance assets were directed with increasing specificity toward observers, signals personnel, and command figures. The language in these orders was functional rather than theoretical, but the underlying shift was significant. From using snipers to reduce enemy numbers, to using snipers to reduce enemy capability. The distinction produced different target priorities, different patrol objectives, and a measurably different effect on how German positions in the forest were able to function under sustained pressure. Jones filed his patrol report, answered the questions put to him by the intelligence officer assigned to collect statements, and returned to his billet. The Silver Star recommendation was submitted through the standard channel. He was not present for the analysis sessions at headquarters. The conclusions drawn from his actions that morning were reached by men sitting at tables with maps and statements, working backward from a result that had initially seemed impossible toward an explanation that, once assembled, was entirely logical. The forest had not changed. The weapons had not changed. What had changed, for one morning on one frozen ridge, was the quality of the silence between shots. Wars produce two kinds of history: what happened and what people need to believe happened. These two versions are not always in conflict, but they are never identical. The factual record is assembled from documents, testimonies, and physical evidence, materials that survive the chaos of combat in incomplete and sometimes contradictory form. The second version is assembled by human memory operating under conditions of fear, exhaustion, and grief, compressing complex events into forms that can be carried and retold. Both versions contain truth. Neither version contains all of it. The historian's work is to hold them simultaneously and resist the pressure to collapse one into the other. The story of William Jones and the potato suppressor began moving through the 4th Infantry Division within hours of the patrol's return on December 8, 1944. It passed first between the men who had been on the ridge, men who had witnessed the events directly and described them with the specific, unembellished language of soldiers reporting what they saw. From there it moved outward, reaching personnel who had not been present and who received the account second-hand, third-hand, and further. By the time Christmas arrived in the division sector, the phrase "potato silencer" was in circulation among men who had never met Jones and could not have explained the acoustic physics involved with any accuracy. This is the normal life cycle of a battlefield story, the compression of complex, multi-factor events into a single memorable image. A man, a potato, a silenced rifle is not fabrication. It is the cognitive adaptation of men who are simultaneously processing combat, loss, and the requirement to continue functioning. A story that can be told in 30 seconds and remembered without effort serves a real psychological function in that environment. The simplification is not a corruption of the truth. It is a different relationship with it. The honest accounting of what happened on December 8, 1944, requires maintaining two positions at once without allowing either to cancel the other. The first position is that the core event occurred and is supported by the available record. A 12-man patrol secured a fortified German position on Hill 319 with no fatalities through a combination of accurate rifle fire, deliberate functional targeting, and the acoustic properties of a winter forest in the Eifel region. The after-action materials, the individual witness statements collected by divisional intelligence, and the patrol reports filed through the chain of command support this sequence with sufficient consistency to treat it as established fact. The outcome: Hill 319 taken, German garrison neutralized, is documented and not in dispute. The second position is that the mechanism was not extraordinary in isolation. A raw potato affixed to a rifle barrel with cloth and tape does not function as a precision suppressor in any engineering sense. The 30-06 cartridge fired through a Springfield M1903A4 generates a supersonic projectile whose pressure wave at the muzzle cannot be fully contained by any improvised material of that density. The ballistic crack produced by the bullet in supersonic flight, a sound physically separate from the muzzle blast, cannot be eliminated by a device attached to the barrel. These are physical constraints, not matters of interpretation. What the potato altered was the character of the muzzle blast specifically, the sharp, high-frequency initial crack that the human auditory system uses most reliably to locate a firearm's position. In the acoustic environment of the Hurtgen Forest on a wet December morning, with dense canopy overhead, saturated air, irregular ground, ambient wind noise, and the background rumble of artillery to the north, that alteration was sufficient to prevent immediate localization by defenders who had not anticipated fire from that direction and whose alertness had been degraded by 3 months of continuous defensive occupation. The conditions amplified the effect of the device. Jones understood which conditions to use. That is the actual distinction, not between a man with a clever tool and men without one, but between a man who had spent 6 years learning how a specific type of environment processes sound and a military institution that had not yet formalized that understanding into operational guidance. William Edward Jones was awarded the Silver Star for his actions on December 8, 1944. The citation described accurate and sustained sniper fire that neutralized enemy defensive capacity and enabled the seizure of a key tactical position. It did not mention potatoes. Military award citations are formal documents written in institutional language, and improvised field modifications do not typically appear in that register. The fuller account exists in the patrol reports, the intelligence statements, and the stories that circulated through the division during the winter of 1944 and 1945. Jones survived the war. He returned to Idaho after his discharge. The historical record does not preserve a detailed account of his post-war life, not because nothing happened, but because the men who fought in the Hurtgen Forest were not, as a group, men who sought documentation of themselves. They came from places where the measure of a man was what he did, not what was recorded about him. Jones had grown up in a town of 3,700 people, where a missed shot meant less food on the table. He returned to that world and continued in it. The Hurtgen Forest campaign was officially concluded in February 1945, after approximately 5 months of continuous operations. The total cost to the United States Army was estimated at 33,000 casualties, killed, wounded, captured, and missing. It was among the most expensive engagements in American military history, measured against the ground gained, and it produced none of the visible, memorable outcomes that tend to anchor public memory of a conflict. No celebrated commander emerged from it. No single decisive day defined it. No dramatic breakthrough gave it a clear narrative shape. It was a slow, grinding, costly operation that ended when the strategic situation around it changed, not because the forest had been defeated in any conventional sense. What the Hurtgen produced instead was a record of men operating at the outer boundary of what human beings can sustain, adapting continuously, improvising within severe constraints, and occasionally discovering that the most effective resource available was something carried from a previous life entirely unrelated to war. A technique developed in an Idaho garden to avoid wasting ammunition while hunting squirrels became, in the right forest and the right conditions, the mechanism by which a 12-man patrol achieved an outcome that 3 months of conventional operations had not been able to replicate at any scale. The lesson that survives is not about potatoes. It is about the relationship between knowledge and environment. A tool has no fixed value. Its value is determined entirely by the conditions in which it is applied. Jones did not invent a superior weapon. He recognized a specific set of conditions that would make a simple modification sufficient, and he had the patience, developed over years of necessity, to wait until those conditions existed before he acted. The Hurtgen Forest stood unchanged through the spring of 1945. The snow melted into the pine needles. The frozen ground softened. The bunkers remained where they had been built. The forest had no interest in what had happened inside it during the winter. It recorded nothing and retained nothing. The documentation of what occurred there, the patrol reports, the Silver Star citation, the statements collected by divisional intelligence, and the stories that passed between soldiers who had been present, exists in archives and in the accounts of historians who came afterward. That record is incomplete, as all records of combat are, but it is sufficient to establish what mattered. On a frozen ridge in Germany, before dawn on a December morning, a man from Idaho applied what he knew to the place where he found himself, and it was enough. That's all for today. We've walked through a real event, one that took place in a frozen German forest in December 1944, and left its mark on how a division fought for the remainder of that campaign. The story of William Jones is not a tale of superhuman ability. It is a record of a man who understood his environment and acted on that understanding at the right moment. Thank you for watching this through to the end. It means more than you might think. If this kind of history is what you come here for, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next.